Welcome to another episode of 2 Cents Tuesday. On Sunday, with very little warning, the residents of the north of our island, myself included, were severely impacted by a weather system that dropped several inches of rainfall within a very short period. Within a few hours, roads were made impassable, homes were flooded, cars were submerged, and tens of thousands of people who live in the area between Bexar, Millet, and Rosalie were thrown into a state of panic and anxiety. The timing of this weather system was ironic because it happened on the same day that the 27th Conference of the Parties, or COP27, of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change started in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. This is the sixth COP since the countries of the world came together at Le Bourget in Paris to adopt the historic Paris Agreement that was supposed to have been the catalyst for us, for the globe, for all of the countries in the world to save our planet, and in particular, to help the residents of small island developing states, SIDS like ours, to protect us from the devastating effects of climate change. To say that what has happened since that COP, the Paris COP, COP21, has been disappointing would be a massive understatement. But I will deal with that topic next week when COP27 enters its final days. For this week's 2 Cents Tuesday, I want to look at the part that we play in these disasters. Keith Nichols, who is a friend and former work colleague, who now works at the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, or 5Cs as we call it, said to me a few years ago, climate change is everything, but everything is not climate change. I was struck by the accuracy of that very simple but deeply profound statement. It is true that climate change is affecting every aspect of the lives of residents of small island developing states like ours, from the impacts on health to the effects of hurricanes. No sector and no demographic is spared. Therefore, climate change is everything. But it is also true that not all the severe damage that we experience is the result of climate change. Unfortunately, and I do not like to admit this, we are worsening some of the impacts by our acts of commission, the things that we do, and our acts of omission, the things that we fail to do. That is why everything is not climate change. Now, do not get me wrong. Our climate has changed. We are in the middle of a full-blown climate emergency. In fact, I no longer like the phrase climate change because it conveys a deceptive message of a gradual process that will happen sometime in the future. For us, the reality is that future is now, and the impacts are catastrophic. This is a climate crisis. But the level of damage we saw from the very heavy rainfall that took place on Sunday was worsened by poor or non-existent planning, uninspired and uninformed leadership, and irresponsible personal practices and behavior. Let's start with the first. We have not had any serious planning to guide the development of this country for well over 30 years. In fact, some may say since independence. Things just happen, or they are allowed to happen. An investor approaches a minister with a plan to build a hotel or some other large infrastructure project, and all our governments see are the money that the investor claims he or she will pump into the country, the people the investor promises to employ, and the public relations and political capital the administration will get from securing a new investor. Very seldom is this potential new investment assessed to see how it fits within the overall development master plan for the community or the country. Why? Because these master plans do not exist. One of my science teachers at St. Mary's College, Glenn Long, decades ago, once said to me that, and I quote, "Growth just for the sake of growth is the philosophy of cancer cells," end of quote. He is absolutely right. Cancer is caused by some of the cells in a part of our body growing uncontrollably and eventually spreading to other parts of our body where they form new tumors in a process called metastasis. Sometimes I get the sinking feeling that the type of growth we are allowing to take place in our country is following that same pattern. The sad thing is, government agencies are also major culprits in this regard. How else can we explain why the Dame Paulette Louisy Primary School was built in the middle of a floodplain in Union? The experience from Tropical Storm Debbie alone should have told us this was not a good idea. But clearly, either one agency did not talk to another, or the advice that was given was ignored. It is also why every year, during the annual river desilting program that is undertaken by the Ministry of Infrastructure, the officers of the Forestry Department are left frustrated and annoyed when they see contractors scraping the riverbanks and leaving them even more exposed and vulnerable. And even worse, sometimes uprooting and destroying the saplings and young trees that had been planted along the banks to bind the soil together. How do I know this? Well, I know because I hear the complaints every year. Why have we allowed housing developments, livestock holdings, and other human activity to be established in or near important watersheds and watercourses? Why do we still allow people to build homes in flood zones? Two things inevitably happen. The watershed is severely compromised and contaminated by the human or livestock activity. And when there is heavy rainfall, like we had on Sunday, any and everything and everybody remotely close to the watercourse is left extremely vulnerable. Yet, we continue to do these things because we refuse to engage in any long-term development planning in this country. Then there is the issue of uninformed leadership. Despite our leaders saying all the right things on the international stage about climate change and the existential threat that it poses to our country, they continue to do or promote things that run counter to the danger they are predicting. When the previous administration spoke about creating the Pearl of the Caribbean in Vieux Fort, they were ignoring the fact that even the most conservative climate models for sea level rise show serious impacts to the eastern side of the town of Vieux Fort, with anything approaching a 2 degrees Celsius warming. Presently, we are on track for global warming of 2.6 degrees Celsius. Both Hurricane Thomas and the Christmas Eve trough caused the closure of Uninformed International Airport because the Latuni River, which used to go across the runway, that's the Uninformed International Airport runway, before it was retrained, burst its banks and flooded the runway. Yet, we entertained recreating the Palms of Dubai in the same general area. By the end of this century, the Pearl of the Caribbean would probably have been the lost Pearl of the Caribbean, you know, like the lost city of Atlantis, submerged under at least 1 meter of water. More recently, we have heard of plans to redevelop Port Castries. But this spot is only 1.5 meters above mean sea level. When the mangroves were removed in Gantas Bay and replaced with a concrete wall, the entire area was made significantly more vulnerable to sea level rise. Again, another example of poor, uninformed planning. Some modeling work that was done by the 5Cs showed that with a conservative estimate of a 1 meter increase in sea levels, the land surrounding 35 seaports across the Caribbean would be inundated, and there would be loss or damage to 21 CARICOM airports. A 2 meter sea level rise, which is not unlikely given how quickly the Arctic is warming and how fast the ice there is melting, would result in the loss or damage of 31 CARICOM airports and the land surrounding 35 CARICOM seaports being inundated. I desperately hope that these models and what they imply are being actively and seriously considered by our planners and developers as they review plans for the redevelopment of Uninformed International Airport and Port Castries. If we go ahead and develop these critical ports without paying attention to what the science is telling us, we cannot lay all the blame for the damage that will inevitably occur at the foot of climate change without shouldering some responsibility. Finally, there is the issue of irresponsible personal practices. Just look around you after a major rain event, and you'll be horrified at the amount of household waste and plastic that is left behind. We dump our refrigerators, stoves, sofas, any old appliances, almost anything, anywhere. It is not uncommon to see people dumping old household appliances directly into a river. What do we think happens to these items? Do we think they magically disappear or are safely transported to some waste disposal site somewhere at the end of the river? No, they travel until they get to a place where they block drains, culverts, and watercourses, which in turn leads to serious flooding. We continue to clear trees and vegetation from steep slopes for a variety of reasons, with no thought whatsoever about the high levels of risk and vulnerability we are creating. Where we once had hillsides covered with trees and vegetation that bound the soil together and prevented it from being washed away during heavy rainfall, we now have houses with roofs that concentrate rainfall and deposit that concentrated rainfall within a relatively small land space. All these houses that are concentrating rainfall on the hillsides, serviced by drains that are not meant to handle large volumes of water, combine to worsen the disaster we should have experienced from Sunday's rains. On the positive side, I am happy that everyone is now much more sensitive and aware of the existence and impact of climate change than they were 7 years ago when we started the 1.5 to Stay Alive civil society campaign. It pleases me to hear government and private sector leaders affirm that climate change is real. However, what saddens me is that so many engage in practices, or at the very least, facilitate behaviors that worsen the impacts of climate change. When we assess the damage caused by the rainfall event of Sunday, the 6th of November, we'll find that the loss and damage was significant. We may also find that the amount of rainfall that came down within the short space of 90 or so minutes was unprecedented. Maybe it was a 1 in 100 year rainfall event. I don't know. However, if we do a little honest introspection, we will also realize that we have contributed to the worsening impacts of disasters such as these. So yes, climate change is real. It is very real. But the cover of climate change does not give us an excuse to behave irresponsibly and recklessly. If anything, it reduces our margin for that type of behavior, our margin of error for that type of behavior. We cannot continue to do the things we could have gotten away with in the past. Like the saying goes, we need to check ourselves before we wreck ourselves. Thank you for viewing another 2 Cents Tuesday. Have a safe and productive week. Goodbye.